You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Luke Nathan Phillips. I'm joined today by my co-host, Ciaran O'Connor. Morning, Ciaran.
Good morning, Luke.
And today we have the honor and pleasure of interviewing Dr. Lee Drutman. Lee is a senior fellow in the political reform program at New America, a wonderful think tank in Washington, D.C. that publishes a lot of interesting work. And he is the author most recently of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, the case for multi-party democracy in America. Lee, thanks for joining us and welcome to the show.
Hey, it's a pleasure and honor to have this conversation with you both.
So for all the listeners who might not be familiar with Lee's work before this, Lee is one of the scholars who's been following a lot of the trends in the transformation of American political coalitions and developments in American government institutions over the last couple of years. And been finding some really interesting results, and more importantly, making those relevant to the public discourse on how American politics is changing. It's the kind of thing that normally you would think of a lot of like cloistered political scientists at various universities studying, but he has been uniquely capable, I think, of making it directly relevant to direct political changes in America these days. So I'm actually quite excited to discuss with you, Lee, the basic themes of your recent book, and yeah. So why don't we start off? Tell us a little bit about the backdrop behind the book, what eventually led you to the conclusions, and then tell us about the arguments you put forth in the book itself, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so the book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, which came out in January 2020, was the result of several years of really thinking about this problem of hyperpolarization, hyperpartisanship that I think we're all deeply concerned about because of the fundamental threat it poses to American democracy, and sort of an intellectual journey that I went on, both looking at the historical roots of this problem and how it really built over several decades, and also kind of the institutional structures that made it, I think, much worse than it had to be. And it kind of sent me on a journey around the world to see how other countries organize their political systems and manage conflict and dispute through their political systems. And ultimately, it became quite clear to me that a core problem with our political system is that we have just two political parties, and those parties reify and reinforce these cultural and identity and geographical divides that have become so central to our political polarization in a way that makes it very hard to resolve without really thinking much more broadly about those structures and institutions that make it so hard for us to get along.
So when you say multi-party democracy, you're not talking specifically about adding a libertarian ticket and a green ticket to presidential elections every 4 years. You're talking about something distinct, something that looks more like how political systems, say in Europe and other parts of the developed world, have multi-party systems. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like and how it's different from just the standard two-party politics in America today?
Well, I mean, it's funny that you consider two-party politics the standard, because America is really the only advanced democracy in the world that has just two political parties. It's also very unique in having single-member plurality districts, first past the post districts. I mean, most democracies throughout the world, advanced and developing, use various forms of proportional representation, which use larger districts, sometimes the entire nation as one electoral district, And as a result, votes for third parties are not seen as wasted. Rather, there are many parties, and you vote for the party and the candidates that you like. And then those parties are represented in the government in proportion to their popularity in the electorate. Now, there are many different systems. Some are more proportional than others. And I think it's important to pay attention to how, if we're going to take this conversation about reform seriously, important to pay attention to the design and learn from the successful designs. And the model that I have for a proportional system is actually one that's been used in Ireland for 100 years, which is multi-member districts with ranked choice voting. Australia also uses that. I think the New Zealand model is also a good model. And both of these give you a form of moderate multi-party democracy. I think probably you want to have between 4 to 6 parties. More than that, it starts to get a little too fractured, and that becomes problematic. So I'm not recommending that we become Israel. I'm not recommending that we adopt the Italian political system either, which is a very confusing and constantly changing political system. So I think there are good models out there, and I think it's important for people in America to recognize that our system is the strange one.
So what I have is sort of on the flip side, what are the advantages to political parties? Because, we've had some folks in our orbit, I'm thinking particularly of Jonathan Rauch, who sits on our board, and he's argued to some extent that it's actually the weakening of the institutions and brokers, political parties, career politicians, congressional leaders, smoke-filled back rooms, that have actually contributed to the disintegration of democracy. What do you think of that argument? And what do you think about the advantages of political parties and why those are outweighed by the costs?
I think that you can't have a modern democracy, a modern representative democracy without political parties. Political parties are the central institutions of democracy because political institutions connect voters to government by organizing candidates to run together on a clear platform, building a brand, doing candidate vetting, and structuring the decision space both for voters and for politicians. Democracy without political parties very quickly becomes chaos and demagoguery. Political parties are fundamental institutions, and anybody who wants to do away with political parties, as I know people do, basically want to do away with modern democracy. And it's just as simple as that.
It goes to an interesting point, actually. I agree with your take that the biggest mistake the founding fathers made in context of just designing the political system for the United States from the 1790s onward, aside from all the lack of foresight over the slavery expansion issue, was political parties. I mean, it's well documented that all the major founding fathers were kind of intellectually, at least, and sometimes even emotionally, kind of unwilling to accept that political parties would exist, and so didn't put a lot of thought in the, at least at the beginning of the government, to setting up a helpful party system. Now, ultimately, over time, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton would lay the foundations of the party system, not so much by design, but just on an ad hoc basis while they were trying to outbid each other for influence for their own factions over national power. But you said in your foreign policy article, summarizing some of the themes of this book, that James Madison's Federalist Number 10 is in many ways an argument for multi-party democracy. Even if it didn't explicitly say that in that piece, and you've also argued that for a lot of the most successful timeframes in American political development, even though we've only had two parties, they were porous enough and they were multifactional enough that functionally we had a multi-party system in terms of who actually held power in the two parties themselves. Can you go into that a little bit and give us just a description of how American politics at its best works and how it's worked in the past on that front?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. So let's start with James Madison, because any conversation about American democracy should really start with James Madison, who was the theorist of the Constitution. And Federalist Number 10 is one of the most brilliant essays ever written about politics, because Madison is really wrestling with the fundamental question of pluralist democracy, which is that in any democracy, in any system of self-governance, you're going to have disagreement. I mean, that is what politics has to be about, because the issues where people agree and have consensus are just not political issues. And there's going to be a diversity of interests. And so how do you build a political system in which that diversity of interests can find a way to build compromise and to enact some sort of policy that is broadly seen as legitimate? And this is a serious challenge. Madison, as did the other framers, had studied a lot of history of early republics and democracies, and they had seen how civil war was a persistent problem. And I think a lot of them were not particularly optimistic that American democracy would even survive, given the long record of failure. And what they understood was that when things get divided into two competing camps, then you have a majority that tries to oppress a minority, and a minority who sees the system as illegitimate. This is basically what, in Washington's farewell address, he's warning of rival political parties based on geography who will see the other side as illegitimate, and then you'll have chaos and eventually turn to authoritarianism as a way of one side crushing the other, which, is eerily prophetic, I think, as we watch the way politics has been developing in the U.S. So Madison basically deals with this problem by saying the way for a system with lots of competing interests to be illegitimate is to broaden the scope, have many competing factions, and let them bargain it out. And the coalition should be fluid so that there are no permanent winners, no permanent losers, no permanent enemies. And Madison's first great concern was with religious liberty. And one saying he was especially taken with was an aphorism from Voltaire that, basically Voltaire says, if there's one religion, it's tyranny. If there's two religions, people are going to war with each other over what happens after they get their heads chopped off. And if there are many religions, people can live in peace because nobody's afraid that they're going to be dominated. And that insight has been proven time and time again by social psychology experiments, that if you put people in these minimal groups and you put people in group A and group B, pretty soon group A starts hating group B and group B starts hating group A over very little. But when you do those experiments with three groups, you don't find any of that hatred. There's something about our brain seems to be really prone to this binary us versus them thinking. And when you have a political system that reinforces that, we go into this us versus them mode and stereotype and character and view the other side as dangerous, extreme, different. And this is fundamentally what Madison was trying to prevent. Problem, of course, is that the framers thought that you could do this without political parties. And the Republic was still pretty small at the time, although quickly they discovered that political parties are essential for organizing politics. But at the time also there was no other system of electing representatives than the sort of plurality system which they basically had imported from the mother country, from Britain, proportional. Although actually Jefferson kind of was toying with a version of proportional representation. You really wouldn't have the development of proportional representation until the mid-19th century and the implementation of it in the early 20th century. So, just by virtue of being a little too early, I mean, Madison had the right theory of politics, essentially, but he had the wrong theory of parties. Now, the one thing in the Constitution that actually kind of made the U.S. a multi-party system for a long time was strong federalism, in the sense that you had these national parties that were really these very loose overlapping coalitions of state and local parties. And so they didn't really stand for all that much at the national level. So you had these kind of regional coalitions in Congress. Eventually that kind of worked its way into a four-party system in the mid to late 20th century, with liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats alongside conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats. And that worked reasonably well. You had a somewhat productive Congress in the 60s, 70s, 80s, in which you were able to reach these sort of broad bipartisan compromises, because there was actually tremendous overlap in the party's substantive programs and their regional bases. And the Democrats didn't see Republicans as a threat, and vice versa. There were a lot of communities where there were a lot of Republicans, a lot of Democrats. It wasn't that same urban-rural divide that we have now. I mean, that happened slowly over 60 years, really starting in the 1960s. Civil rights was a key issue in kind of realigning and reorienting the parties. But I mean, basically the short version of that is, as culture war politics kind of came to dominate the parties, really starting in the 90s. Democratic Party didn't have really a space for conservatives and social conservatives, and Democratic Party didn't have a space for social liberals. And the parties became more and more clearly distinct from each other. Liberal Republicans went extinct, conservative Democrats went extinct. Democrats became much more a party of professional class and urban cosmopolitan America. Republicans became much more a party of rural and exurban, traditionally conservative America. More and more people had social circles that were just very partisan, and the introduction of cable news accelerated that. So I mean, a bunch of forces kind of came together, and I would say by 2010 or so, we really had a genuine two-party system, truly nationalized, with no real overlap in those coalitions, and closely divided national elections in which every election control of power in Washington was up for grabs. And that meant that whoever was the minority party didn't want to make any compromises that might help the majority party. And because the parties are heterogeneous coalitions still, that disagree on a lot of policy issues, the way to build unity is to cast the other party as extreme and dangerous. And that rhetoric filters down, and it organizes partisan hatreds, which then feed back to politicians, because voters then say, well, don't compromise with the other side. You told us they're evil. And partisans who get elected are the ones who are best at reinforcing that rhetoric. And you wind up with what I call a doom loop of escalating partisan warfare, because there's no other way to have there seems like there's no way out, because there's no off ramp. If you want to be a politician who tries to bridge the aisle or work compromise, there's no space for you in either of the parties. And so those politicians have gone away, and they've gone extinct. And as a result, voters have no space to kind of even form a partisan identity that is separate from the Democrats or the Republicans. And so much of the information stream and the rhetorical energy of parties is demonizing the other party.
So as we move through kind of the post-Civil War era and, the binary begins to harden, if you think of maybe there being four parties in the 60s that include liberal Republicans.
You mean the post-civil rights era?
Yeah, and that, begins to compress into, the two parties we have today. And then we arrive at 2016, and I read in that foreign policy piece, you sort of play with the counterfactual of if Hillary had won, it's likely we would have seen the same hyperpolarization as the right mobilized in opposition and, enjoyed the dividends that come with demagoguery. But I wonder if we played with a different scenario where in 2016, suddenly we had taken a strong right turn and we had a multi-party system. And so you had Congress made up of different factions. You had like the John Kasich faction, you had the Trump faction, the Cruz faction, and then you had the Hillary faction and the Bernie faction. How do you think that would have played out? How would the last 4 years have been different if you had that sort of more, parliamentary style representation in the United States?
Well, I think, so want to understand how the incentives work different under a multi-party system. Now, in a two-party system, you win elections by just not being the other party. So there's a strong incentive to engage in negative partisanship and scorched earth rhetoric. And you don't really have to stand for any set of policies because you can just be not the other party. Now, in a multi-party system, the incentives of politics are different because you actually you can't just be not the other party. You actually have to put forward a positive vision for governing to distinguish yourself from other parties, as as happens in multi-party systems. And the fundamental process of governing also requires compromise. So you can't just go around and demonize all the other opponents, because you actually have to work with them to govern and build a coalition. So, probably you would have seen a coalition form among three of those parties if you put the sort of moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans in the center of that. It would either they might not form a coalition of themselves, but they would be in a pretty strong position to form a coalition with either a more conservative party, which I would think of as a Cruz party, which wouldn't have gotten pulled so far to the Trump extremes, or with a more Sanders Democratic Party. But in either case, the two center parties would be in the driving seat, a driver's seat of that, and would be able to work out compromise policies. I mean, one of the things about U.S. politics, and when you view it in a comparative context, is that on a lot of substantive policy issues, including regulation of the economy and that the Republican and the Democratic Party are not that far off from each other, and that even on immigration, there's if you look at kind of the mainstream within both of those parties, that there's a somewhat obvious compromise position on a lot of issues that they could work together. But what happens is that the elections become all about the issues on the identity issues on which they strongly disagree, and the elections become so much about drawing sharp contrasts that it spills over into governing. And so the incentives are not to work with the other party and to demonize the other party, instead of because that gives you electoral gains. In a multi-party governing system, when you're in a coalition with a couple other parties, one, you can't really demonize them because you're governing with them, but two, it doesn't pay you any electoral dividends to do that. Also, on a societal level, what that would mean is that people are much more likely to have in their social networks and in their communities people of different political parties. and to see some commonality with different political parties. So there's not that sense in which partisan identity becomes this all-encompassing way of viewing everything, and thus shuts down the ability to dissent from orthodoxy and to disagree. What it encourages is complexity of thought, right? When politics is binary, thinking becomes binary, and you can't criticize your own side because you're just helping the other side. But if you imagine a spectrum in which people can, maybe on some issues you might be further left, some issues you might be more in the center, maybe, you can kind of, maybe some issues you're a little on the right, you can vote for different parties in different elections that are a little bit shade in one direction, right? I mean, as opposed to having a thermostat where it's only super hot or super cold, and, you have to decide whether it's going to be super hot or super cold, and we wind up all going from shivering to sweating constantly, and that's not, as I think there were some Nazi experiments in World War II that showed going from extreme heat to extreme cold is really terrible for the human body, and it is for the polity too.
It is, interestingly. I feel like for all the heat expended, both during the Obama administration and in the Trump administration, over very highly technical and technocratic policy issues, and for all the almost apocalyptic talk about this is going to be the thing that pushes us all the way down the road to serfdom kind of thing. Inevitably, whenever you look at the details of a lot of these the policy things under question, they're really a lot more. You're right. There's a lot more, number one, bipartisan common ground between the centrist factions and both parties, but also it's not like either party has really been talking about truly revolutionary pathways outside to the outside of the American tradition, the way you routinely have among like small parties in European democracies. So I think there is a sense in which you're completely right. The fact of having a totalizing two-party system raises the stakes of discourse without actually raising the stakes of policy. And in some ways, that probably makes for worse policy, while it makes for worse discourse as well. So real quick, though, I do want to bring into this conversation the fact that there have been a couple voices from different sides of the political spectrum who are arguing at least in the late Trump era and onward up to this point, that American politics is realigning to the state where you'll have multiple factions of both parties. Stephen Tellis just wrote a book recently looking at the intensive years-long activism of Never Trump Republicans inside the GOP and their efforts through institutions like the Bulwark and the Niskanen Center to articulate a kind of post-Trump conservatism that doesn't expect to dominate the party, but it does want to have a playing role that doesn't really fit a party dominance kind of strategy. And then on the other hand, there's a lot of particularly like democratic socialist types, members of the DSA, folks like Bhaskara Sunkara, people in the socialist sides of the left, who really don't like the DNC mainstream of the Democratic Party and want to carve out a social democratic or democratic socialist faction in the Democratic Party that can hold negotiating power there. And additionally, there's at least some possibility that the Never Trump faction in the Republican Party probably could maintain relations with the Clinton, DNC, Biden wing of the Democratic Party against the populist wings on their own sides, while there's probably room for the kind of Tucker Carlson to Julius Krein nationalist wing of the GOP to work on some key kind of questions of, I don't know, industrial policy, healthcare questions with explicit socialists on the left. So do you think that that those realignments, do you think they're just seeing something out of wishful thinking, or do you think there's something there but it's not sufficient? What's your thought on the resurgence in thinking about faction by I guess wannabe factions nowadays?
So you just described a multi-party system that is hidden within the two-party system. Steve Tellis and his co-author Rob Selden have written a very interesting and important book, and there's also a Niskanen Center paper in which they really lay out this faction argument called "The Future is Faction," which I enjoyed reading it. And I think Steve and I have talked about this, and I think we share a pretty similar vision of how we think politics ought to work. And it's that, that's a Madisonian vision of fluid factions, kind of operated in the 70s and the 80s within the two-party system. Now, I think where Steve and I disagree is whether it can continue to operate in the two-party system. Now, that those coalitions in the 70s had a tremendous amount of overlap. And the partisan control of Congress was not really in doubt for much of that period, because Democrats basically controlled the House, and everybody knew Democrats controlled the House. And also there was a sense that Republicans were going to be the party of the presidency, and there was sort of this extended period of divided government where it was clear that a lot of voters were going to vote Democrat for Congress and Republican for president, and that the parties should work together. In fact, there were a lot of members of Congress who represented districts and states that voted one party for Congress, usually Democrat, and another party for president. So there were tremendous political incentives for parties to work together. And also the parties themselves were much more decentralized. The role of parties in funding and financing elections was much less. There was much more space for individual members and individual factions to carve out distinct brands within a sort of broader weak party label. I mean, in the 70s, there was a fashion that the parties themselves were going to go away entirely. And that was sort of, the people writing books like "The Party's Over," "End of Parties." Today, people have much stronger partisan identities. Elections are much more nationalized. Parties operate these tremendous fundraising arms that standardize nationalized messaging. There is tremendous nationalization of media. So it's very hard for individual wings of the party to carve out, meaningful identities separate from the party. In fact, what happens is that the Democrats across the board get tagged as AOC socialists, even though AOC and her friends are a small part of the Democratic cohort in Congress. And similarly, Republicans get tagged as the most extreme state legislator saying some crazy comments. Also, it helps that they have Trump in the White House, who is also crazy. But right, I mean, so that it's very hard to carve out those independent identities, and because the control of Congress is up with each election, there is tremendous pressure for everybody to get in line and put aside their differences and just get Joe Biden into the White House, or just keep Hillary Clinton out, right? I mean, without an alternate space to have disagreement within the parties, or has to get in line, and then when it comes to Congress, leadership holds tremendous power, and members could change that, but they don't. For reasons we can get into. So if you want to do any freelance negotiating of policy across party lines, you are going to be punished by leadership, and you're going to be punished by your primary voters who don't like that kind of activity. So there's very little space for that. There are factions within the parties, but the moderate Democratic faction has very little incentive to work with the moderate Republican faction, which is very small right now, in part because it's the regionalization of the parties, that although there might be moderate Democrats out in the country, they're not the moderate Democrats who are, or just say moderate Republicans, say there's lots of, there might be more moderate Republicans out in the country, but the Republicans who are getting elected to Congress are mostly getting elected from solid red districts and solid red states. So it's very hard to see how those folks get to Congress in our current system.
But is it possible that we have actually an opportunity in 2021 to buck the trend in some respects? I mean, at the executive level, the rhetoric of Biden is night and day when it comes to unifying versus divisive. And then in the Senate, there does seem to be an incentive, with folks like Joe Manchin in the Democratic Party and Susan Collins in the Republican Party, who Manchin actually endorsed and who won her race in part by burnishing her bona fides as somebody who would stand up to Trump. And just given the real that there could be such a close thing, you could see some bipartisan compromise now.
Tell me a story of how that happens.
Well, I see a story of, say, that Republicans control the Senate by 1 or 2 seats, and Joe Biden is able to get the votes of Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, who bang out a compromise with Joe Manchin, given that for Collins and perhaps Murkowski, the incentives actually drive compromise rather than just simply falling in line with the lingering Trumpism.
So on what specific issue? On a stimulus bill for
well,
spending?
You're already seeing the bipartisan, $900 billion coronavirus bill being introduced. I mean, it remains to be seen whether McConnell will move forward on that at all.
Right.
But
well, yeah, here's the challenge to that, and you mentioned McConnell. So McConnell and McCarthy in the House, they understood that their story is that their objection and obstruction to anything that Obama did worked. It got them the trifecta in 2017, allowed them to have their run of things.
Right.
And they understand that if Biden is an unpopular president, Republicans can win back the House in 2022, can hold the Senate in or win back the Senate, depending on what happens in Georgia in 2022. So they don't want to work with they don't want to work with Democrats because they want to punish Democrats and then get back maybe the trifecta in 2025, right? Now, it may be that, Manchin and Collins and Murkowski have the best of intentions, but, nobody's getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate. So McConnell still, only needs 41 votes, and he'll have those to stop anything. I mean, you can do some stuff through reconciliation, but it's much more limited. And then there's a question, Democrats in the House are much more progressive. And Democrats are going to say, there's a lot of Democrats in the House who might say, what are we voting on? Like, this is we should be fighting for more. I mean, maybe they'll grumble with it and go along with it, but I mean, it's the same problem that Boehner had with his Tea Party wing, which is that he had to rely on Democratic votes to pass a lot of stuff. So I mean, but the Republicans in the House are also not eager to. So I mean, the incentives are just complicated now, and that's the problem. I mean, Manchin and Collins and Murkowski may be able to come up with some middle ground point, but I mean, the middle ground has been there all along. It's not. It's a question of can they get the sides. Everybody knows what a compromise position would have looked like on all of these bills. It's just the incentives on both the D side and the R side were not to pass them. I mean, when for much of this year, I mean, they passed the initial package, but with this with this latest round, Pelosi thought she had the upper hand, and she could force that Republicans would have to pass something because Trump was president and they didn't want the economy to tank, hurting Trump's reelection. But maybe she overplayed her hand Who knows? But she wasn't about to give Republicans a victory, unless it included a whole bunch of Democratic priorities. And then as it got closer to the election and it looked like Trump was going to lose and Biden would be president, and then Republicans didn't want to pass anything that would help a Biden presidency. So this is the problem when all of the incentives are about punishing the other side so that your side gets into power. And, if Joe Manchin and Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski were not this group of 3, but a group of 30, then we'd be in a different place.
So there's a lot of prospective wargaming we could do, I think, about some of these dynamics in government. And but before we run out of time on this session, I do want to bring us to a subject of dear interest to the heart of Braver Angels, and that's the notion of red-blue itself. I think a lot of us in general kind of instinctively know what red and blue are, even though those are notoriously sticky terms to define. It's almost like the whole "you know it when you see it" kind of thing. But recently, and Lee, I bring this up because this goes in some key ways, not always, but in some key ways against your general thesis. There's an old tradition in American politics where our two parties, at any point in the American party system, be it the 1790s or the 1840s or the 1890s or the 1930s or the 1970s, represent two different strains of thinking in the American political soul, right? And the two most recent articulations I've seen of that are number one by Ezra Klein in his book Why We're Polarized, which came out a couple years back, and then number two, Michael Barone, who wrote a very short book called How America's Political Parties Change and How They Don't, a couple years back as well. And basically, they both argue that that there's a structural reality to either party that results in a cultural way of thinking about it. The way Barone puts it is that the Republicans have always seen themselves as the party of ordinary Americans, and that they don't have much diversity in them, but they do represent the quote unquote common man, right? Whereas Democrats have always seen themselves as a coalition of outgroups, be that immigrants from various other countries or minority groups or very small kind of economic substratums in society, right? And Klein's take on that is that that's true, but that basically means that the Republicans have had a crusading mentality, whereas the Democrats have tended to have a pragmatic and diversity mentality about their politics. So I bring that up because that argument basically suggests that red and blue is not just a post hoc justification of polarization that has cropped up since the 1990s or since 2010. What that argument implies is that there's a kind of natural cultural reality of red and blue in American politics, and it just happens that our system now structures things so that that's the main thing we do. So Lee, I bring that up because I'm curious in your thought on that. Do you think that is a reality that we can rebuild our institutions in a multi-party system around to kind of distribute people on either side of the party system and make compromises more possible? Or do you think that's that analysis is flawed in itself? Or what's your general take on that?
Well, I think that analysis is an incredible oversimplification. I mean, certainly given the coalitions of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, there are ways to kind of essentialize that coalition. But to say that, 70 million people are, you can put them in this box defined by these few words, and you can put the other 70 million in this box defined by these few words, does incredible injustice to those 70 million people who are much more complicated and diverse. And, as we were talking about before, there are parties within the parties, right? But politics gets defined by the things that divide the parties, not by the things that unify the parties. And the Republican Party coalition, the Democratic Party coalition have shifted and changed, and the parties really are focused on finding the things that connect them, and the things that connect them internally and divide them externally. So are the Republicans the party of ordinary Americans? I mean, what's an ordinary American, right? I mean, Democratic Party for a long time was the party of the working class, and maybe it's still that. I mean, what is the working class? I mean, these are just incredibly baggy and meaningless labels, but yet they reflect the way that we are forced to think in this binary, which is to invent these binaries, which then reify identities and kind of turbocharge that us versus them thinking by saying, oh, well, Republicans are the party of ordinary people, therefore the Democratic Party is the party of strange people, of foreign people. Oh, the Democratic Party is the party of immigrants, therefore the Republican Party must hate immigrants, right? I mean, you can do this kind of post hoc justification of what the coalitions are, but the coalitions are much more complicated and diverse, and rather than embracing that diversity and seeing it as a potential space for finding different and fresh compromises and solutions, the two-party system forces us to essentialize that and view what's different as strange and threatening rather than as a potential partner for governing.
Point taken. Now, before we get towards the end here, I do want to take this to the very pragmatic realm. So, what are the steps that you think it would be necessary to get to a multi-party democracy politics? Is it constitutional amendments? Is it laws breaking up political parties as trusts or something like that? Or what's the well?
I mean, the solution is very simple, and it's something that most other democracies have done, is that they set up electoral rules that are proportional. So in my book, I suggest that we use ranked choice voting, which is gaining some momentum. It's being used in Maine, just passed in Alaska. It's been being used in a bunch of cities, which allows voters to rank their candidates and then doesn't punish third and fourth parties as spoilers, but allows their votes to transfer if they get eliminated. And to use that in a proportional multi-winner context in the U.S. House with multi-member districts, again, basically doing what Ireland has done for almost 100 years. I would also increase the size of the House of Representatives to bring in more diversity and make space. I think that the Senate, in my book, again, this is entirely constitutional. Article 1, Section 4 gives Congress broad powers. In the Senate, we could use ranked choice voting. Again, that's entirely constitutional. It would have to be single winner ranked choice voting. One thing we could explore with the Senate, although this would require a constitutional amendment, would be to have a second class of senators who are national senators. So we had 50 national party senators. This would be doing what New Zealand does, is having a representative for your state, and then having a compensatory proportional seats, so that if Democrats are supported by 40% of the voters, they should get 40% of the seats, regardless of how the particular state populations and work out. Which I think would also create space for more parties in the Senate as well. But I mean, look, we've changed the rules and updated the rules of our democracy throughout our history. And it's something we've done periodically. And it's something the framers, I think, expected us to do, is this was the Constitution was a guideline, and it was a philosophy, and that's what Madison set forward. And most of the world now uses some form of proportional multi-party democracy, and in some countries it goes a little haywire. But it offers, I think, a better path forward to recognize that America is a diverse, pluralistic country, and rather than putting us into these binary categories and making us feel like somebody who's not in our team is a threat to our team, we expand the teams, and then suddenly we can see more in common with each other.
And in terms of the most realistic path to that kind of legislation, would that be Democratic control of the Senate leads to an elimination of the filibuster, meaning that if Democrats control the Senate, House, and presidency, they're able to pass this?
I mean, that's one way it could happen. I mean, I think a better path forward, and the path that we're on, is for states to start to adopt some of these new voting rules and to demonstrate as a kind of proof of concept, and also to get people a little bit more familiar with them. And ultimately, I think what you saw in the progressive era, in which we did some really major democracy reforms, including direct election of senators, introduction of primaries, suffrage of women, is that the Progressive Coalition was really this sort of cross-partisan coalition. It wasn't necessarily a centrist coalition, but it added a kind of almost second dimension to politics, which you could call the reform dimension. And I think we could see that again, that it's not left, right, center. It's reform versus non-reform, and that reform can cut across from the far left to the far right. In many ways, it's probably more of a generational thing than it is a partisan thing, and that there's a new generation of folks who are in politics who are looking around saying, this doesn't work. I know you've been doing business this way for a long time, but like all we do is yell and scream. It's a whole lot of sound and fury that it symbolizes nothing, but somehow it results in a lot of death threats. So like, what are we doing here?
In some ways, that's I guess the light at the end of the tunnel. Whenever you see references to the fact that we're living in a new Gilded Age kind of thing, and all that. But the Gilded Age, back when it happened, was followed by the Progressive Era, and so there is a really deep precedent in our own national history for doing this kind of thing. Lee, we appreciate you bringing your thoughts here. This is very interesting stuff, and I think to the degree that there's any one primary takeaway that I take out of this for the work of Braver Angels and Depolarization, it's that there's a really constructed nature to a lot of our disagreements. It's not that they're not real. It's just that the way our system works and the way things are framed inflames things to worse than they have to be. And that gives me extreme structural hope that there's ways that we can move forward with this from here. So, we're almost out of time, but real quick, do you have any last comments? And would you like to tell our listeners where they can follow your work?
Yeah, so I would just build on what you're saying about the importance of understanding the structural reasons why, despite a lot of well-intentioned desire to reach compromise, that there are just tremendous incentives at the very top to stoke that division. It's sort of like the levees have broken and things are flooding, and we need to build a new stormwater management system. And it's hard to do. And sometimes it can feel like, you just want to, deal with the problem that's right in front of you. And you need to deal with the problem that's right in front of you. But we also need to expand our thinking and really have a vision of, what is and it's not going to happen overnight, but we need to have a vision of what does politics look like 10 years from now, and how do we get there? And I think that means that we're going to need some big structural changes. As for where people can follow me, I'm on Twitter at Lee Drutman, and people can also search for my book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop: The Case for Multiparty Democracy in America, which is available wherever people buy books these days. I look forward to continuing these crucial and ongoing conversations.
Well, worry not, Lee. We will definitely be in touch in the coming years, I'm sure. This conversation is one of many, I think, that the reform community and the depolarization community can have on some of these very interesting issues. So on behalf of Braver Angels, thank you for joining us. And Ciaran, thank you for being here for this podcast as well. Lee, it's been a wonderful conversation, and we look forward to doing the next one of these. Meantime, for everyone listening in, if you're interested in supporting the work of Braver Angels, you can find us at braverangels.org. Become a member, join a BA Alliance near you, like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. And whether you're red or blue or purple or need a whole new political party in this prospective future multi-partisan system that we've been discussing with Lee, you are invited to join us to do our timely work of bringing Americans together across political divides and making for a healthier civic discourse of patriotic empathy for all Americans. Join us. We're always looking for more volunteers. So we are Braver Angels. We're building a house united. Thank you for joining us, and until next time.